So we are going to be continuing from our last video, episode 45, where we walk through the setup of a new Blazor Web App project template, focusing on why to pick one option versus another. If you followed through on that video, you should be at this point where you now have a Blazor Web App project with no interactivity setup. When using this project template, if no interactivity is selected on the project options screen, you end up with a project that can be used to create static server-side rendering solutions. So how is this static server-side rendering really different from the regular interactive modes of using Blazor? Well, unlike the interactive modes of Blazor, which rely on WebAssembly and a persistent server connection using SignalR, Blazor with static server-side rendering functions like a typical server-side rendering technology such as ASP.NET MVC, Web Forms, JSP, and many others that you might have heard of. The benefit here is that the page loads very quickly and does not rely on any additional technology to maintain its rendered state. Blazor server falls apart when the SignalR connection is broken and may have limitations on how many users can be on the page given that each user represents one persistent connection to the server. With the static server-side rendering approach, it means that the browser requests a resource on the server and all rendering logic happens on that server, and static HTML is all that's returned to the browser. Now, what's the value proposition of that? So there's a distinction between the standard server-side rendering and what Blazor is doing. Whereas normal server-side rendering will return the entire static HTML on every call, this approach returns only the parts of the HTML DOM that have changed between calls, making it far more efficient. With this efficiency, however, comes some limitations. For instance, full server-side rendered solutions would allow for the rendering of JavaScript and CSS, and really anything you want returned. This approach only allows for parts of the DOM to be updated. Now that we have the boring stuff out of the way, let's look at a demo. So in this demo, I'll be showing a basic server rendered page. Let's try to keep it as simple as possible and just use the home page that comes by default with this. We will be simulating a login page and using this demo to showcase the events available to Blazor pages. First, let's create a code section on this page. The code section allows you to write C# code side by side with HTML markup. In here, I'll add a new class to capture login information. We'll call it login info. I'll add an email address, password, and Boolean flag to indicate whether the user is logged in or not. The green squigglies are showing up because nullables are enabled right now. To disable it, open the project file and disable them. We now add a credentials property in the code section that is of the login info type that we just created. Blazor uses data binding as opposed to procedural assignment as a way of passing values into controls and the user interface. This means that you won't be doing any instance.text or instance.background color kind of thing that you might be accustomed to if you're coming from desktop or mobile style development. This property is going to be used to bind to some controls that we're placing on the page. To see this at work, I'll instantiate the credential property's email address property with a value and then add an input box to the page that binds to that value. Blazor also comes with a control for input called input text that can be used instead of the HTML input control. Adding this to the page, you can see that the binding approach is somewhat different between the two. Let's run this and see what shows up. Looks like the binding worked as planned. This kind of binding works in either direction. So in interactive applications, when you update the text in the text box, the backend email address field would also change. But what happens in server rendered pages? Well, to answer that question, let's start by adding a button to the page that would trigger the click event. Let's also go ahead and add an input for the password field and bind it to the appropriate underlying property. We now create an onLogin method in our code behind and enter some code to check if the username and password match some parameters we set. If the credentials are correct, as you can see, I set the logged in flag to true. On the page, we can then add some logic that will display some text based on whether the user is logged in or not. We do this by checking the value of logged in and rendering the appropriate HTML based on the result. If you've used the Razor syntax, you should be very comfortable with this. We also need a way to connect the clicking of the button to the onLogin event handler for it. We do this in Blazor by prefixing applicable HTML events with the @ character. So onClick becomes @onClick. Within this attribute, we can simply provide the name of the method it targets. This isn't necessary, but to help with understanding the event model for Blazor and how that is affected by using static server-side rendering, let's add the overrides for the various Blazor page lifecycle events. OnInitialize is called every time the page initializes. For interactive pages, this is called only once, unless a refresh is triggered, of course. OnAfterRender is called when the page completes a render cycle. This applies to interactive pages as the contents are interactively rendered without the need to recreate the entire page. And finally, onParameterSet is called after page parameters are set to their subsequent properties within the code behind file. We're just about ready to run it, but before doing so, we add breakpoints to the if statement on the page, all events on the page, and the onLogin callback method. Once we run it, you'll notice that the first breakpoint hits the onInitialized method. Next, we hit onParameterSet. Finally, it should go into the HTML page and follow the path of logged in equals false. Oops, it looks like we have a bug here and inadvertently bound the email address property to our password field. Here's a great opportunity to showcase the edit and continue features of Visual Studio. Without stopping the debugging session, we'll change that property and also add a type attribute to the password field that indicates it should be treated as a password. You can see that doing so reloads the page, and now it's being treated as a password. Before moving forward, let's use the same technique to clean up the page and add some labels to these fields. Finally, let's get rid of explicitly setting the email address property and just set the entire thing to a new blank object. And of course, we'll need to remove the duplicate welcome to your app banner. So we've got the page looking pretty clean. Now let's enter some values for username and password and click on the login button. And you should note that nothing happens. This is because this page is not interactive. So the only way to send data to the server is using good old-fashioned HTML in the form of either a form tag or JavaScript. And we know JavaScript won't work. Let's apply a form tag to the solution and see what we gain from it. We now have the initialized method being triggered, but nothing else. And you'll notice that with each call, nothing is being updated. To solve for this, we start by using the built-in Blazor control called the edit form. This control emulates an HTML form but has additional capabilities that give it an advantage. When you specify this, you will have to provide a name for the form, a model that the form should use, which relates to the property, and a backend method to call when the form is submitted. To get this all working, we will need to make one small change to the code behind. As the form is being submitted as form data, we need a way of indicating to the framework that this data should be placed into our credentials property. This is done by decorating that property with the supply parameter from form attribute. With this in place, we run the code and should have a fully functional page. And I'm just gonna clear all breakpoints except for login. And as you can see, email address now says test123, password now says test456. And of course, if we enter the correct values, note that it now says you are logged in. This basic page can be easily turned into an interactive one with a few easy steps. First, in the program.cs file, we need to incorporate interactivity by adding a few new methods. From the response to add Razor components, we simply add interactive server components. And from the response to map Razor components, we simply add interactive server mode. Next, we go back to the page and somewhere in the top, add the @render mode keyword with a value of interactive server. You can do this kind of shift for both WebAssembly or Blazor server, but when WebAssembly is used, it requires a separate WebAssembly project to host the components that will be downloaded to the client browser. Let's explicitly make a distinction between the controls that are in a form from the controls that are not. And now I'll re-add the breakpoints that we removed. And run. So first we hit initialize, then we hit on parameter set as usual, then we hit initialize again. Why is that? This is because with Blazor server, the initialize function is called twice. Once on the server side when it's rendering for the purpose of returning HTML, and once when the entire connection is established. And as you can see, you should now notice that when you enable interactivity, on after render is called as expected. And there you have it. In this video, you learned how to create a static server-rendered Blazor project and how to enable data capture in it. We also learned how to enable server-side interactivity and how that impacts a page's lifecycle events. We showcased some of the controls in Blazor and showed you how to wire up event callbacks. Finally, we showed conditional rendering on the server side. In the next video, we'll be delving into common use cases in Blazor and providing you with demos of all of them. If you like content like this, please like the video, share the video, and of course, subscribe to our channel to keep getting stuff like this. Happy coding, and as always, have a blessed day.